He thought it was just another day in the woods. But when his dog started barking at a strange mound of earth, the elderly ranger realized something was wrong. What they found beneath the surface amazed even the experts. Subscribe so you don't miss any new stories, and write in the comments. The morning began as it always did for Ray Harding, with the sound of the kettle whistling softly in the small kitchen and the faint creak of wood under his boots. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional groan of the porch settling with the humidity of Louisiana air. Ray moved deliberately, each motion carrying the weight of repetition, of years lived by schedule and habit. He poured black coffee into a tin mug, stood by the window for a moment, and looked out at the forest wrapped in dawn mist. The trees were still, their outlines silvered by dew. The world seemed calm, steady in the way he trusted. At 70, Ray had learned to take comfort in sameness. After decades in the military and another 2 working as a forest ranger, he had come to see routine not as monotony, but as peace. His children had long since moved away, scattered across different states, and his wife's picture, resting beside the old radio, was now more memory than presence. Only one living companion shared his days, a black German shepherd named Kaiser. The dog was grizzled around the muzzle, his movements slow but alert, his loyalty undiminished. Kaiser had once been a working dog, trained to detect explosives. Now he was Ray's shadow, his silent partner through every patrol, every walk, every stretch of quiet forest. Ray clipped the leash to Kaiser's collar, though both knew it was unnecessary. The dog never strayed far. He set his mug down, picked up his ranger's hat from the nail by the door, and stepped outside into the thick, damp morning. The scent of pine and wet soil filled his lungs, heavy and clean. The forest always smelled the same after a humid night alive and unbothered by human worry. The path that wound away from the cabin was narrow and lined with tall grass. It was the same route he had taken every morning for years, a looping trail past the old cypress grove and the fallen oak that marked the halfway point before it curved back toward the creek. He walked with slow, sure steps, his boots sinking softly into the earth. Kaiser padded ahead, stopping from time to sniff a patch of grass or listen to the faint scurry of some hidden creature. The early light slanted through the trees, catching the dog's black fur with streaks of bronze. To an outsider, it would have looked like nothing more than an ordinary morning, an old man and his dog, keeping watch over the woods. But for Ray, every patrol was an act of quiet discipline, an unspoken promise that he would notice what others missed. Halfway along the trail, near the old oak, he noticed something new, a small mound of earth that hadn't been there the day before. It sat right on the edge of the path, a modest rise of dark, freshly turned soil. He paused, leaning on his knee to take a closer look. The mound was about the size of his fist, its surface broken in places where tiny grains had been pushed upward from below. An anthill, he thought. Nothing more. Louisiana forests were full of them. He brushed the dirt lightly with his glove, noticing how soft it was, then straightened again. Kaiser, however, didn't move. The dog stood rigid, ears tilted forward, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. "What's gotten into you?" Ray muttered, though his tone was gentle. Kaiser circled the mound, nose close to the ground, then looked up at him as if expecting an order. Ray gave none. "Leave it," he said finally, and they continued down the trail. But the image of that small mound stayed with him for the rest of the walk, lingering in the corner of his mind, like a word he couldn't quite recall. The next morning, he noticed it again. Only this time, the mound was larger. The soil had dried slightly, and the surface seemed rougher, uneven, as if something beneath had been working hard through the night. He crouched down, watching for a few moments. The ants were there now, moving in narrow lines, carrying bits of debris across the tiny hill. They were larger than the ants he remembered from childhood, a darker reddish brown that caught the sunlight like polished metal. He watched their precision with mild fascination. Every movement seemed purposeful, coordinated. "Hard workers," he murmured. But Kaiser didn't share the admiration. The dog kept his distance, his gaze fixed, his ears twitching. When Ray rose to leave, Kaiser hesitated, then reluctantly followed. By the end of the week, the anthill had grown higher still, no longer small, but reaching nearly to Ray's shin. That was odd. Ant colonies could build quickly, but not this quickly. He made a note in his weathered field journal. Large anthill, northern trail. Growth rate abnormal 2 to 3 inches per day. Species unidentified. Observation ongoing. It wasn't the first time something peculiar had happened in the forest. Nature had its rhythms, its surprises, but Ray's instincts told him to keep watch. Each morning he returned, measuring the mound with his eyes, sometimes with a stick for scale. The ants were always busy. He'd crouch quietly, listening, and sometimes he could swear he heard the faintest rustle from within, like dry sand shifting. The air around it felt warmer too, perhaps from the sun, perhaps from something else. Still, he refused to give in to speculation. He had seen too many men jump to conclusions in his lifetime, both on the battlefield and in the woods. He called his old acquaintance Dr. Myers, a biologist who had once served with him decades ago and now worked at a nearby university. He described the anthill in detail, its size, the pace of its expansion, the strange organization of the ants. Myers listened, then chuckled softly. "Sounds like you've got yourself a nest of fire ants, Ray. They've been spreading this far north for years. Aggressive little devils. Don't mess with them too much." Ray thanked him, though the answer didn't feel complete. He knew fire ants, had seen them plenty of times on the job. They didn't move like these didn't build such dense, almost architectural hills. But he let the matter rest, at least for the day. The next afternoon, clouds gathered low, heavy with rain. He decided to check the trail before the storm hit. The forest was quieter than usual. The birds had vanished into shelter, and the air smelled of ozone and wet bark. When he reached the bend by the oak, he stopped short. The anthill had changed again. Wasn't just taller, it was wider. The edges spread outward into the grass, the soil dark and clumped as if freshly churned. Around it, a small ring of dead grass had appeared, a pale border against the green. Kaiser refused to go near it. The dog planted his paws, his muscles taut, eyes fixed on the mound. Then came a deep growl, low and uncertain, the kind a dog gives when instinct senses something wrong, but the mind cannot name it. Ray felt a faint unease trickle through him. He took off his hat, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and crouched again. The ants were everywhere, thousands of them, their bodies glistening as they moved in perfect order. He reached out with the tip of a stick, gently disturbing the surface. A few ants climbed onto it immediately, their mandibles locking onto the wood. He lifted the stick closer, inspecting them under the dim light filtering through the trees. They were indeed larger than normal, with darker heads and thicker bodies. When he lowered the stick, the ants scurried back toward the mound, undeterred. The rain began to fall just as he turned for home, a soft patter that thickened into a downpour. He walked briskly, his old knees aching. By the time he reached the cabin, his shirt was soaked through, and the smell of wet earth clung to him. He hung his jacket by the door and rubbed Kaiser's fur with a towel. The dog paced restlessly, unsettled. "It's just ants," Ray said aloud, but the words rang hollow even to him. That night, sleep came slowly. He could hear the steady rain outside, the drip of water from the eaves, and beneath it all, a faint, rhythmic whisper, as though something moved beneath the soil. He told himself it was imagination, the echo of rain against the ground. but his mind didn't let go. He thought of how quickly the anthill had grown, of the warmth of the soil beneath his fingers, of Kaiser's quiet growl. At dawn, he rose again, unable to rest. The air was heavy with humidity, the world outside pale and steaming. He followed the trail once more, his boots squelching softly in the mud. The anthill stood exactly where he had left it, untouched by the storm. The water hadn't flattened it, hadn't even scarred its surface. If anything, it looked more compact, as though the rain had only made it stronger. He leaned on his walking stick and stared for a long time. Nature was supposed to yield to weather, to wind, to water, to time. This thing didn't. The thought disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Kaiser sat nearby, ears flicking, eyes never leaving the mound. For the rest of the morning, Ray patrolled his route, making mental notes of other changes, the slow decay of a cypress trunk, a new set of raccoon prints near the creek. But the anthill stayed in the back of his mind, heavy as a stone. He didn't like things that didn't fit the pattern. Years in the field had taught him that every irregularity meant something, and the forest was a book he had learned to read by instinct. That evening, he sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sun sink through the tree line. Kaiser lay at his feet, panting softly. The cicadas hummed, a chorus rising and falling like breath. Yet somewhere behind that familiar sound, he imagined he could still hear it, the faint shiver of soil, the whisper of tiny bodies working in unison. He finished his drink, set the bottle down, and spoke quietly into the air, though no one was there to listen. "Guess we'll keep an eye on it, boy." Kaiser lifted his head at the sound, then rested it back down. The forest darkened, the fireflies came out, and the trail beyond the trees lay hidden under the weight of night. But Ray's mind was not at ease. He had seen enough in his life to know that trouble rarely announced itself loudly. It began small, barely noticeable, a quiet mound of earth on a trail you'd walked 1,000 times before. The next morning, he took his coffee earlier than usual, restless before sunrise. The air felt different, too still. Kaiser sat by the door, waiting without command. Ray pulled on his boots, slung the worn canvas bag over his shoulder, and started out once again along the familiar path. His joints protested each step, but the rhythm of walking steadied him. It always did. When they reached the oak, the first light of day cut through the trees. The anthill loomed larger than ever. The ring of dead grass around it had widened, and the mound itself had split slightly at the top, revealing darker soil within. Ray crouched close and pressed his fingers gently against the side. The dirt was warm to the touch, strangely soft, as if hollow underneath. He withdrew his hand slowly and wiped it on his trousers. Kaiser gave a short bark, one of warning. The dog's body stiffened, every muscle drawn taut. Ray stood, his gaze fixed on the mound. The sunlight glinted off the moving forms of the ants, their bodies swarming, endless, unstoppable. He reached for his notebook and wrote without hesitation. Anthill, Northern Trail. Significant increase in size. Ants highly organized. Soil structure loose. Area expansion observed. Continued daily observation. He closed the notebook, tucked it into his vest pocket, and looked once more at the forest stretching silent around him. The woods had always been his refuge, a place of order, balance, and predictability. But as he turned back toward home, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in that balance had shifted. The forest, for the first time in years, felt alive in a way that unsettled him, not because of noise or movement, but because of its silence. The silence that waits before something changes. And so he walked on, the trail bending beneath his boots, Kaiser following close behind. Neither of them looked back, but both knew they would return tomorrow. because that was what Ray Harding did. He observed, he measured, and he kept watch over the land. Only this time, he had the uneasy sense that the land was watching him in return. The days that followed blended into one another, each marked by the same heat, the same heavy air, and the same quiet rhythm of life in the woods. Yet beneath that familiar surface, Ray Harding began to feel a change. It wasn't dramatic at first. The forest still looked the same. The tall pines stood unmoving in the thick morning haze. The creek still whispered softly against the stones. But something in its balance felt altered, as though the silence had deepened into watchfulness. He could sense it when he stepped outside at dawn, when the dew still clung to the grass and the world seemed half asleep. The forest, his companion of decades, was no longer indifferent, was listening. Every morning, Ray followed his usual routine. He walked his route, checked for broken branches, cleared away debris from the trails. Kaiser padded along beside him, obedient but cautious. The old dog no longer bounded ahead as he once had. Instead, he kept to Ray's side, occasionally glancing toward the bend near the fallen oak where the anthill stood. When they reached that familiar spot, Kaiser would halt and stare, the fur along his spine bristling. Ray would murmur a command to move on, but even his own voice had started to sound uncertain. The anthill had grown again. What had begun as a mound, the size of a fist, now reached nearly to his knee. Its surface was hard-packed and ribbed with tiny tunnels, the soil a darker color than the surrounding earth. Around it stretched a widening circle of dead grass, the blades brittle and yellow. Ray crouched down to inspect it and noted the faint hum beneath the surface, a sound he could feel more than hear, like distant static buried deep in the soil. He poked the mound gently with the end of his walking stick. A flurry of ants erupted from the openings, but not in the chaotic swarms he was used to seeing. These moved with precision, forming lines, carrying grains of dirt away in an organized rhythm. The sight unsettled him more than he admitted. Nature had its patterns, but this felt too exact, too deliberate. That afternoon, he decided to take action. He filled a metal bucket with water from the creek, the same way he had handled countless smaller nests over the years. The ants would scatter, the mound would soften, and by morning, the forest would reclaim the spot. He carried the bucket back along the trail, the water sloshing against the sides. Kaiser followed reluctantly, whining as they approached the anthill. "Easy, boy," Ray said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. He lifted the bucket and poured. The water splashed against the mound, darkening the soil for an instant before vanishing. He poured again, slower this time, watching as the stream disappeared into the earth, as though the ground itself were swallowing it. The soil did not collapse or dissolve. It absorbed. After a few minutes, the bucket was empty, and the anthill stood firm, slick with moisture, but unchanged. The next morning, Ray returned to find it taller. The top was dry again. The surface hardened into small ridges that glistened faintly in the sun. He stared for a long moment, then crouched down, pressing his palm to the ground. It was warm, far warmer than the air around it. He pulled his hand away quickly, his mind searching for explanations. Perhaps decomposition? Chemical reactions? He made another note in his journal, his handwriting slightly less steady than usual. Water applied. No effect. Possible heat source beneath. Unidentified species. Rapid growth. Continue monitoring. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about the soil was different, that the earth here was no longer entirely earth. Still, he kept his reasoning practical. There was no place for superstition in a ranger's work. The forest spoke in signs, and every sign could be read if one paid attention. Over the next several days, more changes appeared. The grass near the anthill turned completely yellow. Ants began venturing farther from the mound, moving across the trail in thick columns. Ray followed their path and saw that they were branching outward, building smaller rises of soil just beyond the main one. The pattern was spreading. When he returned home that evening, his boots were dusted with the same dark soil he'd seen near the anthill, and Kaiser's paws were streaked with it too. The dog refused to eat that night, lying by the door, ears twitching toward the woods. By the end of the week, the transformation was undeniable. There were now 5 mounds where once there had been one. They varied in size, some small as a loaf of bread, others large enough to trip over. The ground between them sagged slightly, as if hollow underneath. When Ray stepped too close, the soil gave a soft, spongy yield, and he pulled back at once. He knelt and pressed his ear to the ground. There was movement below, a dry rustling, constant and deep. He called the Regional Conservation Office that afternoon. The voice on the other end was polite but detached. They promised to send a team the following week. "We've had similar reports," the woman said. "Probably an invasive fire ant colony. They're nasty, but manageable. Don't try to handle it yourself." Ray thanked her and hung up. He had no choice but to wait. But waiting, he found, was the hardest thing of all. He returned to the site each morning, documenting the changes. He measured the spread, estimated the density, even collected a small sample of ants in a jar for identification. They were unlike any he had seen before, larger, their mandibles sharper, their color a deep burnished red that caught the light like iron. He sent the photos to Dr. Myers, who replied with curiosity but not alarm. "Could be a hybrid species," he suggested. "Happens with overlapping colonies. Keep observing." That night, thunder rolled over the treetops. The first drops of rain tapped against the cabin roof, building into a steady downpour. Ray sat by the window, watching the lightning flare through the cypress branches. Kaiser whined softly, unsettled. The old dog had never been afraid of storms before. Now he paced in front of the door, sniffing, occasionally giving a low growl that made the hairs on Ray's neck rise. The rain came harder, pounding the earth, and Ray thought about the anthill. By morning, he told himself, the storm would wash it away. But it didn't. When he reached the site the next day, the ground was soaked, the trees dripping. The air smelled of wet bark and mud. The anthill stood untouched. In fact, it looked stronger. The rain had compacted the soil, hardening it into a dark, solid mound that gleamed like stone. The smaller hills nearby had survived as well, their surfaces slick but unbroken. The water hadn't weakened the colony. It had reinforced it. Ray squatted down, breathing heavily. For the first time in years, he felt something close to frustration. He wasn't afraid yet, but the failure of simple logic bothered him. The rules of the forest were not supposed to bend. Nature didn't build structures that resisted weather like this. He took out his knife and scraped a thin layer from the side of the mound. The blade struck resistance almost immediately. Beneath the outer shell, the soil was dense, packed like clay. He tapped it gently with the handle, and a faint vibration ran through the surface. He froze. Kaiser began to growl again, stepping backward until he was behind Ray. The vibration stopped, and the silence that followed seemed heavier than before. Ray stood slowly, his knees stiff. He looked around at the surrounding trees, at the curve of the trail, at the faint mist still hanging in the air. Nothing moved. The forest was utterly still. He went home early that day. The sky cleared by noon, but he didn't return to the trail. Instead, he sat on the porch, sharpening his old field knife and listening to the chirr of cicadas. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone was calming. It gave him something solid to focus on. Yet every so often, his eyes drifted toward the woods. He thought about the hollow feel of the soil, the warmth beneath it, the speed of the spread. Something about it didn't add up. He picked up his phone again that evening and called the office to confirm the inspection date. They would arrive in 5 days. He closed his eyes and exhaled, feeling both relief and impatience. 5 days could be an eternity. By the 4th day, the infestation had spread farther than he imagined possible. The mounds had multiplied across the trail and down toward the creek, forming what looked like a cluster of small earthen domes. Some were fresh, loose with new soil. Others were solid, almost sculpted. The ants worked tirelessly, building and repairing, their movements endless. The forest floor seemed alive with them. Kaiser refused to step beyond the porch now. When Ray tried to coax him for the morning patrol, the dog stood firm, head low, tail stiff. Ray sighed, patted his neck, and went alone. The quiet without the dog was different, emptier somehow. The woods had always been full of sound, even in their stillness, but now it felt as though something was listening back. He walked carefully, taking each step with deliberate weight. At the oak, he paused. The mounds stretched across the clearing, connected by thin trails of disturbed earth. The surface between them had begun to crack, lines spreading outward like veins. When he crouched to touch one, he felt warmth again. But this time it pulsed faintly beneath his palm, as if the earth were breathing. He withdrew his hand quickly, heart beating faster than he wanted to admit. By the time he returned home, dusk had fallen. The air was thick with insects, and the first frogs had begun their chorus. He stood on the porch and looked out at the faint line of trees, silhouetted against the dimming sky. The woods he loved were changing before his eyes, and for the first time, he wondered if he could stop it. He wasn't a scientist, not anymore. He was an old man with a notebook and a dog, trying to hold back something larger than himself. That night, lightning flared again in the distance, but no rain followed. Ray sat awake for hours, listening. Every so often he thought he could feel a faint tremor underfoot, a gentle, persistent vibration that rose through the floorboards of the cabin. Kaiser whined once and crept closer, resting his head against Ray's leg. The dog's eyes were open, watching the door. When dawn came, Ray stood, joints aching, and pulled on his uniform. The inspectors would arrive soon, but something in him refused to wait. He needed to see the trail again, one last time before they came. He took his hat from the peg, whistled for Kaiser, and stepped outside into the gray morning light. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind, only the faint hum of the waking earth. He followed the narrow path toward the oak, his pace slower than usual, his eyes fixed on the ground ahead. Kaiser trailed behind, uneasy but loyal. The anthills loomed in the mist, their dark forms clustered together like strange breathing monuments. Ray stopped and took a long, steady breath. His notebook was tucked under his arm, his pen ready. The forest was waiting, and so was he. In another hour, others would come with machines and chemicals, with equipment and answers. But for now, he was alone, the first witness to something that neither he nor the forest had seen before. He felt the faintest tremor beneath his boots, as if the ground had sighed. Kaiser barked once, sharp and short. Ray looked down at the soil, then out toward the quiet stretch of trees ahead, and for a brief, breathless moment, he had the distinct sense that the land itself had begun to move. Then the vibration faded, and all that remained was silence. He tightened his grip on the notebook, turned toward the path home, and whispered under his breath, "Hold steady." The words were meant for the forest, for the dog, and perhaps for himself. Behind him, the anthills stood motionless in the pale morning light, their surfaces cracked and dry, their hidden depths alive with movement. The week had changed everything, and Ray Harding knew that when the men arrived, they would not be facing a simple nest of ants. but something that had already claimed the ground as its own. The sun had barely risen when Ray Harding heard the rumble of engines climbing the dirt road that led to the cabin. The sound felt foreign in the stillness, like something mechanical intruding upon the slow heartbeat of the forest. Kaiser barked once from the porch, not out of excitement but warning, his tail stiff, his body tense. Ray stepped outside with his hat in hand, squinting through the morning light. The white truck of the Conservation Service appeared between the trees, its tires crackling over dry leaves. When it came to a stop, 3 men and a woman stepped out. Young, alert, carrying clipboards, boxes, and bright orange gear. "Morning, Mr. Harding," said the man who appeared to be in charge. His name was Ethan Klein, a field supervisor whose posture carried the easy confidence of someone trained to deal with problems by protocol. "We're here for the infestation report. You filed last week about multiple anthills?" Ray nodded. "That's right. North Trail about a mile from here. You'll see them soon enough." His voice came out hoarse. He hadn't spoken much in days. Ethan offered a professional smile, the kind reserved for calm clients. "We'll run some tests, see what species we're dealing with. Probably imported fire ants. Happens this time of year when the weather turns." Ray wanted to believe him. He wanted this morning to end with a report, a treatment plan, and a handshake. But as they loaded their equipment, he noticed how even the birds had gone silent again, how the air itself seemed to vibrate faintly under the weight of something unseen. Kaiser stood at his side, watching, the tip of his tail twitching. They followed the trail single file, Ray leading the way. The forest was heavy with humidity, and the soil crumbled softly under their boots. The others chatted quietly at first, but as they approached the bend near the fallen oak, their voices faded. The clearing opened ahead, and the anthills rose before them, dozens of them, spread across the ground like an alien landscape. Some stood nearly to Ray's thigh, others clustered together, their surfaces glinting under the sun. The grass around them had turned to ash-colored straw, brittle and lifeless. "Good God," one of the technicians murmured. He bent to examine the nearest mound, brushing his gloved hand over the surface. "These are massive. And, feel this, it's solid." Ethan crouched beside him. "Get the radar set up." Ray stepped back, letting them work. They unpacked a small geophysical scanner, a device used to map roots or underground nests. When the sensor plate was pressed against the ground, the screen flickered to life, filling with gray and white shadows. As the technician swept the probe over the clearing, the shapes began to connect, revealing a network beneath the soil, a lattice of tunnels, chambers, and pathways stretching in every direction. Ethan frowned, leaning closer to the monitor. "That's extensive. I've never seen structure like this." "It's a super colony," said the entomologist, a quiet woman with sharp eyes who had remained silent until now. "Multiple queens, shared tunnels. It's rare, but not unheard of. South American hybrid fire ants sometimes merge like this when conditions are right." Ray watched their faces as they studied the data. He saw the curiosity, but also a trace of unease. "How deep?" he asked. The technician hesitated. "About 2 meters, maybe more. Hard to say where it ends. It's all interconnected." Kaiser growled low, the sound vibrating against Ray's leg. The dog's ears pricked forward, his eyes fixed on one of the larger mounds. A few ants had begun to appear on its surface, moving in straight, purposeful lines. The entomologist set down a vial, unscrewed the cap, and began collecting a sample. She handled them carefully, but after a few seconds, she hissed in pain, jerking her hand away. "They bite harder than they should," she muttered, examining a small red welt forming on her glove. "That's not typical." Ethan straightened, brushing his hands on his knees. "All right, let's treat the area before they spread further. Mark the perimeter, 50 feet out. We'll start with chemical injection, then turn the soil. Ray nodded, but didn't move. His eyes followed Kaiser, who had taken a few steps toward the nearest mound, sniffing the air. "Careful, boy," he said quietly. But the dog didn't retreat. His body was rigid, his nose low to the ground. The team went to work. 2 men carried heavy sprayers filled with a liquid pesticide that smelled sharp and metallic. They inserted long metal rods into the ground, pumping the solution into the tunnels below. Steam rose faintly from the soil as the liquid spread. The ants reacted immediately. They poured from the openings, not scattering, but forming dense clusters around the bases of the mounds. The workers stomped their boots, but the insects didn't disperse. "They're not dying," one man said, shaking his head. "They're moving deeper." "Keep the pressure up," Ethan ordered. "They'll surface once the fumes reach them." For an hour they worked without rest. The air grew thick with chemical vapor, and the ground became slick underfoot. The ants' movement slowed, but the mounds remained intact, the structure refusing to collapse. The entomologist examined a handful of soil through a magnifying lens, her expression tightening. "They're fusing the tunnels," she said, "blocking themselves in." Ray stood silently, the smell burning in his throat. He felt a pang of guilt watching the operation unfold, an odd sympathy for the creatures whose destruction he had requested. They were relentless, disciplined, driven by instinct, not unlike soldiers. He thought of the years overseas, of the men who had dug trenches that swallowed them whole. Nature, he realized, had its own kind of warfare. By afternoon, the decision was made to escalate. Ethan radioed the base and requested heavier containment burn treatment. They cleared the area, spraying a ring of suppressant foam around the perimeter to prevent the fire from spreading. The technicians poured a controlled accelerant over the central mounds. Ray moved Kaiser to a safe distance, holding his collar tightly. The dog resisted, muscles trembling under Ray's hand. When the flame touched the accelerant, a burst of orange heat shot upward. The air shimmered, and smoke billowed through the clearing. The fire burned hot but confined, licking at the hardened surfaces of the mounds. For several minutes, it roared, the sound echoing through the forest. Then, slowly, it began to fade. The charred remains of the anthills collapsed inward, crumbling into black dust. Ethan exhaled. That should do it. The entomologist crouched again, sifting through the ash with a gloved hand. The ground was warm, almost too warm. "We'll need to test the soil," she said. "Make sure nothing survives deeper down. But yes, this will likely end it." Ray nodded, but said nothing. The clearing looked dead now, stripped of color, the earth scorched and dry. He felt no satisfaction, only a hollow fatigue that settled into his bones. He thought of the months he had walked this path, the countless mornings that had passed without incident, the peace he had once taken for granted. The silence around him felt heavier now, the kind that came not from calm, but from aftermath. The team packed their equipment as the light began to fade. Ethan approached Ray, extending his hand. "You did the right thing calling us in. These infestations can destroy entire ecosystems if left unchecked. We'll file the report and keep monitoring the area for a few weeks." Ray shook his hand, feeling the rough grip of youth against the worn calluses of his own. "Appreciate it," he said. His voice was quiet, almost lost to the wind. "This trail's been part of my life for a long time. Feels strange seeing it like this." Ethan nodded with a kind of practiced sympathy. "The land heals. Give it time." When the truck disappeared down the road, the sound of its engine fading into the distance, Ray stood alone at the edge of the clearing. Kaiser sat beside him, panting softly, eyes fixed on the blackened soil. The smell of smoke lingered, mingling with the damp scent of evening. Ray took off his hat, wiping the sweat and ash from his forehead. He didn't move for a long time. The forest was utterly silent now. No birds, no rustle of leaves, not even the faint hum of insects. He crouched, pressing his palm to the ground. It was cool again. The warmth finally gone. But beneath that coolness, he thought he felt something. A faint pulse, distant, like the echo of movement far below. He withdrew his hand slowly, telling himself it was only his imagination, the memory of vibration lingering in his skin. As dusk deepened, he turned toward home. The trail, once familiar, looked different in the half-light stripped of its softness, its quiet beauty replaced by scars of turned soil. Kaiser followed close, his paws silent on the path. When they reached the cabin, the dog went straight to the porch and lay down, resting his head on his paws. Ray filled a bowl of water, set it beside him, and then sat on the steps. He watched the horizon fade from gold to gray. The sky above the trees burned briefly with the last embers of sunset before giving way to darkness. Fireflies flickered in the distance, their glow faint against the lingering smoke. The world felt both smaller and larger now, as though something unseen had opened beneath the surface of what he thought he knew. He reached for his notebook, the leather cover worn soft from years of use. Opening to the last page, he wrote slowly, his handwriting careful and deliberate. Colony neutralized, perimeter secure, forest recovering. Personal note. Observation complete. He paused, then added, everything begins small. He closed the book, placed it beside him and leaned back against the railing. Kaiser lifted his head, sniffing the air, then looked at Ray. The dog's eyes caught the faint glimmer of starlight, steady and watchful. Ray reached down to pat his neck. We did our part, he said quietly. That's all a man can do. The night settled around them, soft and deep. Somewhere far off, a single owl called, breaking the silence. The sound was both lonely and reassuring, a reminder that life persisted, even here, even after ruin. Ray tilted his head back, watching the stars flicker through the canopy. He thought of his wife, of his children, of the years spent walking these woods. He thought of the anthills, the small one he had first noticed by the oak, the ones that followed, the strange, silent growth. And he realized that what unnerved him most was not the ants themselves, but how long it had taken him to notice the change. He sat that way for a long time, until the crickets began to sing again, and the night regained its pulse. Then he rose slowly, joints aching, and went inside. The cabin smelled of pine and old coffee. He turned off the lamp, leaving only the faint glow of the moon through the window. Kaiser settled at the foot of the bed. Before lying down, Ray opened the door once more and looked out toward the dark line of trees. The clearing beyond was invisible now, hidden by distance and shadow, but he could still picture it, the charred soil, the empty mounds, the smoke curling upward like breath. He listened for a long moment, hearing only the wind, and then, faintly, as if from memory, came that same soft sound he had heard before, the whisper of shifting earth. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving nothing but stillness. He smiled faintly, not in fear, but in recognition. The forest would always go on changing, rebuilding, reclaiming. His job had never been to control it, only to witness it. Tomorrow, he would walk the trail again, because that was what he did. He observed, he recorded, he remembered, and somewhere in that quiet duty, he found peace. Ray closed the door, turned off the light, and let the night surround him. Outside, the forest breathed, steady and eternal. The land was silent once more, and beneath that silence, life waited, unseen, ready to rise again. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't miss the next one. Every week, a new story awaits. And if this video moved you, share it with someone who loves a good story too.